Hello and good afternoon. I'm Danae Simmons with the HCI Solution. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. As we go through our educational session, please make sure as to not put us on hold, as the on hold music can cause disruption to the session for others. If you do drop off the call, you're more than welcome to dial back in. We currently have these sessions on our website, and you should be able to go and view them there as well. Our presenter today is Dan Collins. He has been at the forefront of EHR development and customer care for over 21 years while working at Meditech in various roles, and has led data service teams that supported all of Meditech's platforms. As Dan goes through, feel free to jump in and ask questions, and if you have any trouble seeing the screen or hearing us, please let us know and we'll get that addressed quickly. With that, I'll turn the presentation over to Dan.
Thanks, Danae. What we're going to be talking about today is writing a report designer report to pull data from NPR applications. This presentation is very similar to another one we conducted regarding pulling data in from other applications. But the difference with this one is that we're going to be pulling in data from an MAT application. You know, we're going to write a MAT report designer report that'll pull data in from an NPR application. So what we're going to cover today are the different Meditech applications and what platforms they reside on in 6.1. We're going to talk about using the Object Explorer to understand inter-application relationships, and we're going to go over defining data links between those applications, and we're also going to perform a live demonstration of writing a registration report that will pull in lab data from NPR. Okay. So this table represents, in the 6.1 release of Meditech, which applications are written in the MAT programming language, and MAT is both a programming language and a platform. There's a bunch of infrastructure that goes along with that programming language. But this table shows all the applications that were rewritten from client server NPR and ported into MAT. You know, some of these, like some of the clinical applications, were not in NPR. They were in our FS. They're in Meditech's FS programming language, like PCS, patient care systems, EMR, electronic medical records, and it actually, the MAT platform is based on the FS programming language. So the MAT programming language actually generates FS code. On the right-hand side of the table, you'll see the list of applications that are still written in client server NPR. And those are all the ancillary applications like lab, ITS, and pharmacy, and the general financials, accounts payable, cost accounting, general ledger, materials management. And just the 6.1 version of the software, you know, the 6.0 version of the software, going from the 6.0 version of the software to the 6.1 version, there were a couple of applications that were moved over to MAT. That was patient accounting, BAR, which was previously called billing and accounts receivable, and abstracting. I think community-wide scheduling was another one that was moved with 6.1. Oh, registration as well. Okay, moving on. There's some applications that exist in both MAT and client server NPR. That's MIS, Universe, Data Repository. It has code written in both platforms. For registration and HIM is health information management. It's what medical records used to be in CSNPR. Both of those applications still have an admissions and a medical records database on the NPR side. That's because a lot of the ancillary applications still rely on the code from admissions and medical records. So they're still there, and there's basically interfaces set up in Meditech that copies the data from Reg to ADM and then from him over to MRI to keep them in sync. And Meditech, as far as we know, currently does not have any plans to move other applications to the MAT platform. So what we're going to do to demonstrate how you write a report designer report that will pull in data from an NPR application is we're going to, we have this scenario that where we're being asked to write a report that will list off patients that were registered from a certain date range, and on the report we also want to see what lab tests were administered to those patients and what the results were from those lab tests. And we're going to include, these are the fields that we're going to include on the report: the patient name, registration date, the test name, the test result, and if the test was considered to have an abnormal result, we will print that abnormal flag on the report. And also we'll also include the lab, when the lab was resulted, the date and time. So thinking about how we're going to get this report to work, how are we going to get our registration accounts and link them to those patients' lab tests and their results? Patients are stored in the system by the registration OID, but lab specimens and their tests are stored by a lab specimen URN. So how are we going to link those up? How are we going to figure out which lab specimen URNs belong to a certain patient? Well, the answer is there's an index in lab that we will use to, it's a patient index that we will use to associate the lab specimens with each patient. I'll show you that in a minute. Like writing any report designer report, you know, one of the challenging things is determining where all the data lives that you need to display on the report, and also how all the records and objects are related to each other, so you know how to link things. And this slide just shows a screenshot of the Meditech Object Explorer and some of the lab data here that we need to use. So the data that we need to include on the report includes a lot of fields from the lab specimen test record, or as they call it in CSNPR, the lab spec test segment. So if we look at the Object Explorer, we can see what I was just talking about, that this record has two keys basically. It has a URN, and that URN is a unique number for each specimen in the lab system. And then there's also, I believe, test, which is a number that points to the lab test dictionary, and that test dictionary just describes what the test is and, you know, what's considered for abnormal ranges and things like that. So we have to figure out, once we have a registration OID to identify a patient, how do we know which lab specimen URNs belong to that patient? And the answer is this index here in the bottom right-hand corner of the Object Explorer. I've highlighted the lab spec patient index, and its keys are listed here. You can see that the first key is the patient, and that points to lab CPAT. And that patient key shares the same identifier as the registration reg account object ID. So we were able to get the registration OID and use that to find the first key in this index, which in the value of this index, you can see the last key here for the index is the URN, which is the LabL spec URN. So this index will contain a list of all specimens for the patients that we want to print on the report. So here we're just defining the relationship. So the reg account OID is the same as the lab CPAT patient on the NPR side. And then if we're looking at the patient index, the first subscript is the same as the lab CPAT patient. And we can get the specimen URN from that. And each specimen in lab has multiple tests associated to it. So if you look at the LabL spec test segment, you can see the first key is the URN, and then the second key is the test. And the test will have all the fields associated to it that we need to print on the report, like what was the result of the test? Was the test abnormal? When was the test resulted? And so that's really going to be the flow of this report designer report. And generally when writing a report, a lot of your time is spent trying to figure out these relationships and figure out where the data lives. And when we start writing a report, we're going to have to tell report designer about these relationships, and we have to tell it that reg account main is associated to the lab specimens by the lab specimen patient index. And then we tell report designer that the reg account OID will link to the lab patient URN from the patient index. And we'll get into that in a minute as well as we start writing the report. So right now we're going to get into the demonstration portion of this presentation, and we're going to go in and write this registration report in one of our customers' test systems. All right, so I'm going to go in and create a new report. I'm going to call it Reg HCI Lab Results. I'm going to make sure that we set the report to advanced mode so we're able to link over to that NPR lab database. And the linking to the lab database is a lot more straightforward than it is in client server NPR report writing. You used to have to write some code, like to do like a Z-link database code in your macro to open up to that other database. So you'd have to write report fragments. It's actually a lot easier in Report Designer. And I'm going to start adding some of the fields to the report that we want to include. I'll add some of the registration fields first. I'll add the patient account number and name, and I think registration date was another one. We'll do registration date time. And now all I need to do to add client server NPR lab fields to the report is to just go in and select them. Believe it or not, we'll go under objects, lab L spec, and then these are all the fields that are available to us in Report Designer for lab L spec. So we'll go ahead and add, we'll look for the lab test, but what we want to do is expand the blue icon here, and that'll show us the lab test dictionary that this test field points to. And I want to pull out the name. You can see here that these fields, these rows down here point to the lab L test dictionary. And I'm going to pull out the name for this particular dictionary entry for this test. Oops, I didn't mean to exit out quite yet. I'll just type that back in. We're going to want the result of the test. And we're going to want the resulted date and time. Let's see. It's funny, I didn't see it there. I will come back to that one. Let's see. Date. Test result date. I thought there was also, and then we probably want test result time as well. Select that one. And we want to display the abnormal flag, so we can clearly indicate whether or not the result was abnormal. So I may want to go in and adjust some of my field labels. We'll call account patient, and then registration date. We'll just call that registered. And then we'll just call test resulted time. All right, that should be pretty good. And I'll show you. We want to just change the detail of our report to be reg account main and not reg account computed field. So I'm just going to click on the detail cell here, and it'll switch that. And then we need to go in and define our field links to tell Report Designer, okay, how are we going to associate the patients with their lab specimens and tests? So what we're going to do is we're going to choose our reg account main record. We're going to say that that's going to link to the lab specimens tests. And we can't, and since there's no key record, since the lab specimens have their own unique identifier that's not related to the patients at all, we have to link them using an index. There are some other records in the system where, you know, the keys, the reg account OID is the same as like the key, the first key for other records you're pointing to. In that case, you don't need to use an index, but here we need to use an index to relate these two records because they're not related in any other way. So what this lookup gives you a lookup into all the LabL spec indexes. So the index that we want is this one on the bottom here, the patient index. And it tells you here what all the keys are for the index. And we know that the patient key here is the same value as the reg account OID. And then, you know, the value of the patient index. It's funny, it doesn't show it here, but in And the object viewer and the slide, the object explorer that I was showing earlier, the index in the object explorer also listed the specimen URN. You can see that. Let me show you. You can see that here in this screenshot, where here we're listing that we do point back to the specimen URN. I'm not sure why in the link screen it doesn't show that. Let me see. Let me get back to hang on. I'm gonna pull up. There we go. So I'm gonna select that patient index. And then I have to tell the system which fields to use. So right now I'm selecting which field from reg account main do I want to use to point to which field in the index. So what I want to use here is the reg account OID, object identifier, and that's going to point to the patient key in the index. And this, you see, this lookup only shows you which keys are in that that lab index, lab patient index. So we'll select patient. And I think we have to define a couple of other records that link to each other as well, but we'll file that and it'll tell you. If I try to go to the next page, it'll tell us. All right, so it's report designer's happy that we have all the right records defined and pointing to each other. So we're going to now define our selection criteria for this report, and it's just going to be the registration date, a from and through registration date. So we'll say from registration date greater than or equal to, and we'll do a through registration date. Oops. Through registration date. And we also need to add facility. That'll just make the report run a little bit faster because facility is the first key in the index we'll be using. Facility equals and we'll choose our, and I've mentioned it in some of these other educational sessions, but Report Designer tries to present these indexes to you by the number of matches the index keys have with the fields you've already entered in on the selection screen. So we've already entered in registration date and facility, and Report Designer can see that, and it sees that those are a couple of the keys in this index, and so it lists those as green. And the more of the first index keys that you can have lit up in green, that just means the faster your report will run, because you don't have to go through all the patients in the system. You only have to go through the patient. Your report only has to loop through the patients that match the facility and the registration date that you're entering in on the screen here when you run the report. All right, that's good there. Oh, one thing I should show you is on the selection screen, you can see that the Report Designer knows that we've entered in fields from an NPR database. And so now I have this button available to us. It says linked CS database. And you could add, this is really only important if there was maybe more than one lab database. You wanted to make sure you associated, make sure the correct database is associated here. And when you run the report, I think this is a default. You can delete that, and there's only one choice here because there's only one lab database associated to this MAT ring. I mean, there's one NPR HCIS associated to this MAT HCIS that we're writing this report designer report in, and there only happens to be one lab database in that NPR HCIS. But if there's more than one, there'd be more choices here. And then when the user ran the report, the user would have to select the correct database. All right, so let me go to the regions and define our regions. I want a header, page header for this report. And we'll also do a patient trailer. So that we can separate out each patient. Let me see here. Well, just at the end of the detail section, we can do that. So let's go ahead and add our fields to the report now. Okay, so we're going to have patient name and number first, registration, date, test name, resulted time, and the abnormal flag. I'm going to move the abnormal flag closer to the result values. Doesn't really matter. That this is just reordering the fields here. Just tells the system in which order to display them on the report picture, but we can always move them around on the report picture. And we're going to have to do that anyway. So like patient number, name, I'm going to reduce the size of that a little, maybe bring that down to 40 characters. All right, and then we're going to put the headers where I want them. So this is the patient. Want the registration date next. And then we want the name of the test. We want the result, test result. And just as a reminder, if you're not sure, some of these fields are pretty small. You're like, test? What is test? If you look up at the upper right-hand corner, once you have a field selected here, it tells you the whole name of the field up here in the top right-hand corner. I think that the button down here, narrow fields, when that's highlighted, it shows you the length of each field, but I believe if you uncheck it, it will put the full name of the field, but with this, you can't really tell how large the field is. So we're going to click that. We want the test result next. Move that label there. And I want the abnormal flag next. And then we'll put the result date and time next. And I might want to move that label on 2 lines, test resulted. So I'm going to edit that. I'm just going to leave that as test result and bring it down one row. I think that's pretty clear. Let's clean up some of these blank rows. So you have to, let's see, in order to remove blank rows, you have to click on show rows. And we're going to drag and drop this, not this row, drag and drop this row up one to get rid of that row. And there's no easy way. I have not found a real easy way to get rid of this extra blank line here. There's a trick to doing that. You go to the region section of the report, add another detail region by clicking on the button there, and then you go back to layout, and then you're able to take this region and move it up. That's funny. Let's see. Yeah, if for this one, if you uncheck show rows, and then you're able to move up this row, and then we can just go and remove our detail, our extra detail region. And I want to go in and draw a couple lines here to separate the patient header from the detail. So I'm going to do that. And I'm going to draw one down here to separate each patient. And we'll go in and move those to the right places now. So I'm going to uncheck draw lines and then highlight each of those lines that I just drew and make sure they're in the right spot. I'll do that by clicking on edit. And I want to make sure it's all the way over to the left hand side of the report. And I want that to be at the bottom of that row. Same with the other line I just drew. All right, so we'll file this report and run it and see what we get. Reg HCI lab. All right, let's go ahead and run that report. And we'll run it for the last 30 days. So these patients here are showing up, but they're just patients that are registered in this test system. They just don't have any lab tests. And then this first patient here is the first one that has lab tests. And can make a couple of adjustments here. We could see the date and time are running into each other. We can move that time over a little bit, and maybe want to give the result a little more room from the name of the test. But these are all results, and so far we don't see any abnormal flags. We should see those. See, here's a few abnormal test results for this patient. And we can add some restrictions into the report. Like if we only wanted to see patients that have, or if we only want to see lab tests that have results, I'll show you how to put in some record restrictions to just print that. And then you could also add a rule to the report to say, hey, don't print this detail region if this patient does not have any lab tests. So we're not showing patients on the report without any tests. But let me go in and show you that. Show you these couple of things. Let me move some of these fields over. and move this over a little bit. But if we only wanted to show rows that show lab tests that have show lab tests that have a result, what we could do is go into this row and edit this row. Oh, I'm sorry, I have to select show rows here. And you get slightly different options when you go into edit, but this is what we want to see. What we want to do is go under RABL spec tests, and we want to say if tests you want to do something like if test resulted date, we only want to print a lab test if it has a resulted date. So we want to say exists. We want to say test result date exists, then include this record on the report. And we'll click create, and we'll run the report again. And you should see that on the report now, we're only going to get, we should only print off lab tests that have results. And you could do the same thing for if you only wanted to print lab tests that had abnormal flags, you could add another field. You could add another record restriction for that. We obviously need to move the date and time over a little bit, but you get the idea of how this works. It's pretty straightforward. It's a lot easier to link to NPR applications than it is in NPR Report Writer, and it's pretty well integrated. So let's get back to the slide deck. That's pretty much it. Does anybody have any questions about what we just covered? We will, we can have the PowerPoint presentation sent out to you guys, and we will also be posting a recording of this session on our webpage in the weeks to come. We've already started posting some of the other educational sessions that we've done on our website. The videos for those educational sessions are posted there on the HCI solution. If you check our webpage, keep an eye on our webpage at hcisolution.com/webinars. We will continue to add educational sessions there. And thank you all for coming today. Danae, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Just thank you, Dan, for doing this for us, and thank you everyone who attended. And if you do have any questions or would like to follow up with this afterwards, please feel free to reach out to us.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody. Have a wonderful day.